My name is Trevor Felix. I'm Sḳwməthkվəy from the interior of BC. This is my comic, The Land Defending Itself, Responses to the White Paper and Beyond. Keep watching till the end of the video for footnotes and personal reflections. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. We must convince Canadians, and particularly the Indians, that we need to make a choice. Either they become part of the mainstream of Canadian society, they are equal before the law with the same rights as other Canadians, or they remain apart, a little different, not full-fledged citizens. The White Paper was a piece of legislation first proposed in 1969 and made by then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Minister of Indian Affairs Jean Chrétien. The intention of the White Paper was to abolish the Indian Act and all existing treaties within Canada, which would act to strip us of our rights in the eyes of Canada. The White Paper was framed as a way to bridge the gap between Indigenous and settler peoples, a misguided attempt to grant us equality as the government saw fit. They'll stay in the ghetto only as long as they want to stay in the ghetto, to dunk us into the proverbial melting pot. We would become Citizen Plus, equal rights for them pesky Citizen Minus people. Indians have aspirations, hopes, and dreams, but being a white man is not one of them. Public backlash to the White Paper was widespread. Several organizations, including the Indian Association of Alberta, came out in opposition. They rejected the White Paper by publishing the document Citizens Plus, which became known as the Red Paper. They recognized that the policy would strip Indigenous people of their rights and would eliminate treaties and land claims, systematically robbing them of the land that is rightfully theirs. In November 1969, 144 First Nations bands gathered in so-called British Columbia. This resulted in the development of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. They would soon produce a document called the BC Indian Position Paper, aka the Brown Paper. The document asserted Indigenous sovereignty and was in opposition to the White Paper. Similar documents would be passed by other nations in so-called Canada. United we stand, divided we perish. These acts of collective resistance led to Trudeau withdrawing the White Paper in 1970. Their legacy is part of the Red Power movement of the 1960s and 70s, the spirit of which still lives on in movements like Idle No More and Shut Down Canada. Our hands live and work in the present, while pushing on the past. It is impossible for us to not do both. Our hands make a future. We were never meant to survive colonialism, so simply surviving is a form of resistance. Yet I've seen so many Indigenous people doing so much more than that, taking their place as leaders among leaders, students among students, and teachers among teachers. As an individual, I embody the land. We are sovereign bodies, asserting jurisdiction, negotiating our borders every day, hour, minute, and second. Within each of us is a living story. Our stories are a map of the land. But where will these maps lead us if the land is destroyed? This is a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who served as the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932. He oversaw the residential school system during this time. He was known as the architect of Indian policies and an extreme assimilationist. This is a quote from Pierre Elliott Trudeau from a TV interview in 1969. He was the 15th Prime Minister of Canada and leader of the Liberal Party of Canada between 1968 and 1984. Much of his racist legacy has been carried on into the age of reconciliation by his son, Justin Trudeau. Citizen Plus was a term coined in a Hawthorne report, written by Harry B. Hawthorne, who was an anthropologist at the University of British Columbia. He was commissioned by the federal government in 1963 to investigate the social conditions of Indigenous people across Canada. He concluded that they are Canada's most disadvantaged and marginalized population. They were Citizen Minus. He recommended they be considered Citizen Plus and be provided the same opportunities as other Canadians. He also advocated ending all forced assimilation programs, especially residential schools. Jean Chrétien decided to amend the Indian Act based off of this, and despite consultation with Indigenous representatives expressing concern about treaty rights and land title, Ottawa produced the White Paper in June of 1969. This is a quote from Cree First Nation leader Harold Cardinal from his book The Unjust Society from 1969. Harold Cardinal earned a doctorate in law and taught at the University of Saskatchewan. In 1968, as a member of the Sucker Creek First Nation, Harold Cardinal was elected president of the Indian Association of Alberta, its youngest president. During his 9 terms in office from 1968 to 1977, he initiated many programs to affirm Indigenous culture and traditions. The top panel is based off of a photo taken at a press conference that was held at the Blue Quills Residential School in Ottawa, where Premier of Alberta Harry Strom, Harold Cardinal, and Jean Chrétien met to negotiate the fate of Blue Quills Residential School, which is now Blue Quills First Nations College. The full UBCIC brown paper document was entitled A Declaration of Indian Rights, the BC Indian Position Paper. The deliverance of the red paper to Pierre Trudeau was a monumental act of solidarity between nations in itself, and was endorsed by the National Indian Brotherhood. It was presented to Pierre Trudeau on June 4, 1970, when around 500 chiefs and Indigenous people arrived at the Railway Committee Room in Parliament. The Red Power movement was considered to be mainly a Native American movement, consisting of organizations like AIM, the American Indian Movement, and NIYC, the National Indian Youth Council, amongst others. At this time, though, many Indigenous people were organizing worldwide as a response to systemic and overt racism, poverty, inequity, and genocide. Much like the hashtag Idle No More and Shut Down Canada movements, the Red Power ideology was being applied by each respective nation in their resistance to historical and ongoing colonial violence. Acts of resistance to colonialism is nothing new. As long as there has been oppression, exploitation, and violence, there has been resistance. The use of slogans, hashtags, and social media is relatively new though, and have been an important tool for organizing and responding to smear campaigns, a tactic used by RCMP and colonial government to dismantle grassroots movements of the past. The UBCIC logo was used as a reference for the art in the top panel. A well-known photo taken in 2013 during a blockade at Elsipogtog First Nation, which depicts Amanda Polches, a Lakota Sioux and Micmac woman, raising a feather against a battalion of riot police, was used as a reference for the bottom panel. She is depicted raising a feather to the Parliament building in Victoria to symbolize the warrior spirit of the Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and Indigenous youth who occupied the steps of the BC legislature in early 2020. This is a quote by Beth Brandt, a Tyendinaga Mohawk writer. taken from A Gathering of Spirit, the first anthology of Native American women's writing, which was edited by Brandt, and first published in a periodical called Sinister Wisdom, and later reissued in book form many times. She identified as lesbian, and she openly embraced this and her indigenous roots in her writing and life. As one of the first lesbian-identifying indigenous writers in North America, she played a pivotal role as a teacher and mentor to the LGBT Two-Spirit community that succeeded her. For these last 2 pages, I'm going to be giving my own personal reflections. Every measure has been taken by Indigenous people to live in an intersocietal way, but colonialism has countered those attempts with acts of violence, both systemic and overt. Treaties in any form are about upholding good relations between 2 or more sovereign nations. Still, treaties in Canada were used more as a stepping stone by colonial governments on their way to securing their position as an economic superpower, rather than an opportunity to reconcile. Time and time again, our communities are coerced into making decisions based on either severe underfunding, poverty, greed, or all of the above. The inhuman conditions that our communities are subjected is very deliberate. Because after all, wouldn't it be easier to take something from someone if they were starved, addicted, traumatized, or they had no idea what it was they were losing? In this capitalist paradigm, we're all living under arbitrary laws that are upheld only as long as they benefit the colonial state. We live in an economy, not a society, where people are encouraged to take everything they can get and never look back. This mentality invades our everyday lives, pushing us to prioritize financial stability over our own health. We're meant to suffer like dogs until we're desperate enough to sell the land out from beneath us. When everyone but us decides our fates, how do we regain control? By occupying our traditional lands. This shouldn't be a radical idea. We've been led to believe that endlessly fighting in court will work, which it hasn't. No colonial system will ever work for our benefit. It never has been and never will be, because that is not its function. We need to begin emphasizing the traditional Indigenous laws that have been in place since time immemorial, to start healing tensions between sovereign Indigenous bodies, because every right we have has been violated, and we need to uphold more holistic approaches outside of the colonial status quo. Living constitutionalism means that laws are a living thing, just as our world, our land, and we are. Laws should not remain static, as the needs of a community are always changing. We, as Indigenous people, are expected to define ourselves as a whole, while we are individuals who are all complex and growing constantly. It is the goal of the colonial government to dump us all into the melting pot and put us to work. It is a colonial government that makes us doubt ourselves, and we are oversaturated with media, school, jobs, money, rent, until we no longer recognize ourselves or where we came from. Why must we make way for the wholesale destruction of our lands and cultures? The benefits will never trickle down, at least not for those of us who need it most. The stealing of our ancestors' bodies, our tools, knowledge, ceremonies, and sacred objects are not valid unless they're under glass being gawked at by settlers. There's nothing good to be said for the pity and tokenization of our peoples. Reconciliation on the government's behalf has been exposed as a self-serving farce. As I say this, corporations are getting billions of dollars in bailouts, while many reserves don't even have drinkable water still. Everything is going to seem impossible if we keep relying on the colonial government to make a change. Back control of our own stories. Radical love and kindness are the key to fostering good relations across nations. This includes intense reflection on how settler colonialism has affected us on an individual level. My own experience in grassroots movements showed me the resilience and determination amongst Indigenous communities. But I also saw divisiveness. As the world evolves, Indigenous people adapt, but many times there is gaps left in between. Residential schools saw many of our elders forced into a way of life that was wholly at odds with our traditional ways of life. And with that forced assimilation, many of our elders adopted and passed down worldviews that divided rather than healed. Gender essentialism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, blood quantum, and other forms of lateral violence are still prevalent in Indigenous communities. We are all collectively recovering from historical and ongoing trauma, and it's time to heal ourselves. It's time to heal the land.